Well, you're in for a treat today because we're going to take a look at this gorgeous last of the big, great Cadillacs, this 1980 Cadillac Coupe Deville. Now, you may be saying, well, they made this body style for many more years, all the way into the early 1990s, and the big Coupe Deville into the 1984 model year. Before 1985, it transitioned to being a downsized front-wheel drive vehicle. But the 1980 model year really is the pinnacle of the last of the great big Cadillacs for a number of reasons. And let's talk about those first before we take a look at this car in more detail. The main reason for this being the last of the great big Cadillacs is, first of all, the styling was revised in 1980 to have a more vertical backlight, and the purpose of that was to give the car a longer look. They actually wanted to make this car look longer, if you can believe it or not, in 1980. And that was because when General Motors downsized its lineup in 1977, Cadillac received some criticism from its buyers that felt that they just weren't getting what they had paid for because the cars were now smaller than they had been previously. Remember, Lincoln did not downsize its full-size lineup for another few years after that. And so Cadillac buyers thought that they were actually paying about the same, or in some cases a little more, for less car, and that just didn't go over very well. So General Motors designers took the 1977 to 79 Cadillac and they gave it this very vertical backlight, which made the quarter panel look longer and gave the car more presence, if you will. So that's one of the reasons why the 1980 model year is great for Cadillac. The other reason is because, at least in these full-size Cadillacs, the engine and transmission combination never got better after this point in 1980. So up until 1980, if you got a 1977 or 79 Cadillac DeVille, you would get a 425 cubic inch Cadillac V8 turbohydromatic 400 transmission. If you got a Cadillac before that, you were getting the 500 cubic inch Cadillac V8 and a turbohydromatic 400 transmission as well. However, after the 1980 model year, things went downhill pretty quickly. In 1981, Cadillac introduced its variable displacement V8 6.4 as the standard engine in the DeVille series. And while it was basically a 368 cubic inch V8 from 1980, with the cylinder displacement functionality effectively just bolted on, it proved rather troublesome to customers. Now, you can buy a 1981 Cadillac and just simply disconnect the V8 6.4 setup, and you'll have a reliable Cadillac 368 cubic inch engine. But a lot of customers, as you can imagine, just didn't see it that way and were not pleased with the overall cylinder deactivation technology. Now, while you could make that V8 6.4 basically function like a 368 and have a good engine under hood, in 1982, you just could not do that because that was the year Cadillac introduced its HT 4100 or high technology, some say the hook and toe 4100 engine, because it was just an abysmal engine. And unfortunately, it would be found under the hood of the Coupe Devilles in 82, 83, 84, and then when they were downsized in 85, 86, and 87, before it was revised into the 4.5-liter V8 for the 1988 model year. And that 4.5-liter V8 was much better than the 4.1-liter V8. But the 4.1-liter V8 had a number of challenges, first of which was its horsepower and torque, rather diminutive horsepower and torque. The torque rating on the 4.1 was only 190 pound-feet of torque, and you're trying to motivate a car that's almost 4,000 pounds, and it was only 135 horsepower. So while the 368 was just 150 horsepower in the DeVille, it had over 250 pound-feet of torque, I think around 265 actually. And so that's a ton more torque that could really help push this big car around. And on top of the fact that the HT 4100 just didn't have any power under hood when it was under the hood of these Cadillacs, it wasn't reliable either. Cadillac had tons of intake gasket, head gasket issues, number one main bearing issues, sealing issues with use of RTV that really didn't work in some cases. They just were really poor engines, especially in the first years from 82 all the way through partway through 1985. They also had oil pump issues. I guess I could keep going. More and more of these issues are coming to mind. In any case, in general, you don't want an HT 4100 equipped Cadillac. Although I will say I've owned 3 of them, and I've never had a problem with them. Although they can be slow in the rear-wheel drive cars or the front-wheel drive Eldorado and Seville that were being produced from 1985 and prior, the 4.1 actually was a decent little V8 in the downsized C-body cars that came out for 1985. Regardless, if you do end up buying one, be sure you do not drive the engine hard. They will not last very long. And change the coolant every few years with the coolant sealant supplement from AC Delco or Bars Leak. That is factory procedure that was added. That was actually an added factory procedure that General Motors technical staff added to the service manuals after the first year or so that the engine was in production because they had so many sealing issues associated with the engine. So the 368 was great. The V8 6.4 368, not great, but could be made great. The HT 4100, just a poor engine. And then after that, you had the Olds 307 V8 under hood, which wasn't a bad engine, but again, just didn't have the same torque. It was a 5-liter V8 as compared to a 6-liter V8 that Cadillac had under hood in the 1980 model year. And at the very end of the run, when it was called the Fleetwood Brougham, you could get the Chevrolet 350 under hood that was actually fuel injected. That was a pretty good engine, but I think that the Cadillac 368 was really the last good engine that was under hood in these full-size cars. Now back to the exterior styling for a minute before we turn to the interior. You do have this restyle for 1980, as I mentioned, that brought these very distinctive full vertical tail lamps, very similar to what was on Cadillacs in the mid-1960s. And I think they're a tasteful treatment. Cadillac always had these perfectly vertical tail lamps. And on these big cars, I think it works and works out overall pretty well. Unfortunately, on this car, you do have those bumper fillers, rather large ones. In this particular car, they're still in good shape. But something to watch out for, that's a costly repair in the event those bumper fillers are cracked. And you do have these super cool dome top wheel covers, if you will, something that you wouldn't find on many Cadillacs. Most of them would have the fake wire wheel covers, but these wheel covers, I think, actually look good for the car, and in this case, they're body colored. So they look even better and give the car an overall different look from the later versions of the vehicle that would be out when the car was called the Fleetwood Brougham. Now, turning to the inside of the car, this is where the fun really began. And this is a DeVille d'Elegance. And so you get the super plush, loose cushion look to the seats. In this case, the seats are velour, which I think is great. I love that material because you stick to it. So in these big boats, when you're trying to go around corners relatively fast, you don't slide all around. And if you have leather or vinyl seats, the limiting factor is not the tire adhesion. It's actually, can you stay in your seat? Because there is no lateral bolstering at all in these cars. But this is kind of a cool look to the cloth, maybe a little bit of an ostrich leather look, if you will, something that Cadillac had in the late 1960s, and perhaps they wanted to bring it back. Unfortunately, aside from the seats and the door panels, which have that fuzzy velour covering the entire top of the door panel, the rest of the interiors in these Cadillacs, well, it's okay. It's not great. Lots of fake trees gave up their lives for the dashboard, and I don't think that the wood grain is all that convincing, at least the one that Cadillac used here. For whatever reason, to me, the lighter fake wood grains just don't look nearly as real as the darker ones. And you have a pretty pedestrian speedometer, no real gauges aside from a fuel gauge, which is interestingly in the middle of the dash above those vents. And here's a view of the center stack of the controls. You can see you have the passenger mirror control at the bottom left. You have the rear defogger at the bottom right. You have Cadillac's typical automatic climate control set up with the little wheel and the temperature at the middle position at the bottom. And then this car has an 8-track tape player, a digital 8-track tape player. So this one is pretty darn cool. 8-track tape players were on their way out by this point, but apparently not for this Cadillac buyer. And here you can see what I mean by really not having any gauges aside from the fuel gauge. This is really the only readout that you have in these cars is the speedometer and then the transmission shift indicator. But, well, aside from the idiot lights, which are in a panel above the speedometer, you don't really have much to say what's going on under hood, and I suppose that's how Cadillac wanted it. They didn't want their buyers to have to worry about what was going on under hood. I think I can hear the Cadillac divisional management now just saying that, well, you shouldn't need a temperature gauge as an example because the car shouldn't ever have overheating issues. We should engineer it so it doesn't have those issues. And by and large, I will say that Cadillac cooling systems were actually quite good. The Cadillac V8s, well, the Cadillac V8s before the HT4100 had really good water pumps, unlike the Chevrolet V8s where the water pumps tended to fail relatively frequently. I don't think I've ever had to replace a water pump on a Cadillac V8. They seem to work really well. And the cooling capacity with the radiators was actually really robust. So the cars overall were engineered pretty well and to stand the test of time and be durable. And of course, we couldn't leave a discussion about this Cadillac without a look at the rear seat. You notice that there's a rear center armrest, and then you have that wonderful velour in that, I'm just going to call it ostrich leather print style look with these big buttons and loose cushion look. And that fuzzy velour continues on even into the C-pillar. You can see it there. So it's just acres and acres of velour during this time frame if you are a Cadillac buyer. And I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I wish they would bring back velour. I'm tired about leather seats and seeing them in so many cars. They're just ubiquitous. When you can get leather in a super low-end car, you know it's time to get something different and make something different, a high-end material. And there you have it, a look at this, the last of the great big Cadillacs, this 1980 Coupe Deville. What do you think? Is this the last of the great big Cadillacs? It actually was so influential that the front grille on these 1980 Cadillacs was actually reused later on when the car became the Fleetwood Brougham. They had gone to different grille textures over the years, but they brought it back when the car became the Fleetwood Brougham, and perhaps rightly so. It has this kind of Rolls-Royce-y texture and look to it, and I think that's well suited for the car that this was. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.